Now, we could go into specifics of Old Testament judgment if you want to talk about the Canaanites or those kinds, or Noah even.
Sure.
But those are judgments based on the idea that people have sinned. And it's up to God when God judges people. Look, if Christianity's true, people don't die, they just change location. They go from this life to the next life, and it's up to God when that happens. God is not arbitrary in the Old Testament.
Well, is God arbitrary? The God of the Old Testament sure does seem arbitrary. I feel like narcissistically laying down a bunch of rules for people to follow, obey, and worship you so that you can be happy is pretty fucking arbitrary. And then, of course, God gets pissed off and goes into a drunken rage whenever people don't make him happy. Now, that's not to say that some of these rules can't have good reasons behind them, and perhaps those were the real driving factors for making these rules. But as far as what the Old Testament says, or the reasons that the Old Testament gives for laying down these rules, it's really just arbitrary. Essentially, sin is just transgressing God's opinion. Frank Turek and other apologists like him think that God's opinion is the most supreme opinion and should be revered amongst all other opinions. But then again, that also would be arbitrary as fuck.
So let's take the Canaanites, for example. Why does God kill the Canaanites? He gives them over 400 years of warnings to move out of the land and stop their detestable practices. But their practices kept getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where they were literally sacrificing their children on the molten hot idol known as Molech. Even Solomon did this, by the way, that they would put their babies on the arms of this idol and watch their babies sizzle to death.
First of all, Frank acts like ancient Israelites were not also practicing baby sacrifice. There were some Israelites that were sacrificing their children for Yahweh. Heath D. Durrell points out the number of times in the Old Testament where child sacrifice is mentioned positively and is even practiced. While the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, Genesis 22, is probably the most famous example, there are also less well-known tales, such as Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter in fulfillment of a vow, Judges 11 through 12, and King Mesha of Moab's sacrifice of his firstborn son during what appeared to be a hopeless siege, 2 Kings 3. Various biblical law codes demand that the firstborn of one's cattle and flocks be handed over as a sacrifice to Yahweh, but some passages suggest that the requirement applied to firstborn children as well. In most cases, firstborn children are to be, quote, redeemed, end quote, via the offering of a sheep, example Exodus 34:19-20, or a cash payment to the priest, example Numbers 18:15-16. But in at least one case, no form of redemption is mentioned, Exodus 22:28-29. Possibly indicating that firstborn children were sacrificed in some Yahwistic circles. Child sacrifice in ancient Israel. Heath D. Durrell. Jephthah's daughter sizzled either to death or was cooked post-mortem. Exodus also has God specifically killing young children in the final plague to Egypt. That's God killing children and babies in order to accomplish something that he could have easily accomplished without the need for the senseless slaughter of innocent children. Now, you could say, oh, well, the Pharaoh refused to let him go and blah, 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 blah. But then you have to explain how God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that basically Pharaoh pushed God into the position where he's like, ooh, now I get to kill the children. Like some evil comic book fucking villain. So I think that you can see plainly that God simply doesn't care about the senseless murdering of young children. The only thing that this God cares about is whether or not children are murdered for him. Because then it's okay. The thing that Yahweh was judging the Canaanites for was not the only thing that the only thing that Yahweh was judging the Canaanites for was for not sacrificing and murdering children for him. That was the detestable thing they were doing. They just weren't worshiping him. Don't let apologists like Frank Turek try to convince you that God has a problem with the senseless slaughter of innocent children. He's obviously fine with it and has even practiced it on occasion.
In fact, Plutarch, who's a Greek writer, not a biblical writer, he's writing about in the first century, and he even talks about this. And he said that the drummers around this sacrifice would play their drums more loudly so the parents couldn't hear the screams of their own children.
Frank is basically correct about Plutarch here. This comes from Plutarch's On Superstition text, and he doesn't specifically say parents, he just says in general people, so I'll let that slide. But still, Yahweh doesn't have a problem with baby sacrifice or the immorality of the action. And like we mentioned before, the Israelites had no issue with sacrificing children as long as it was done for Yahweh. Going back to one of our examples, Jephthah had promised God that he would sacrifice the first thing to run out of his house to greet him if God were to help him defeat whoever in the fuck they hated that day. God, being the omniscient fuck that he is, knew exactly what was going to happen and still made that particular pinky swear. He knew that Jephthah was gonna have to sacrifice his daughter, a young child. The author of this text even had the daughter encourage Jephthah to sacrifice her. Of course, they framed it as keeping the promise to God, which just goes to show that there's no issue when it comes to child sacrifice as long as it is to appease God. Their God specifically, not just any God. So God obviously has no issue with immorality of child sacrifice. The only thing that God seems to care about is whether or not you obey and worship him. And what's considered immoral is to transgress his holy opinion. And that has nothing to do with the moral nature of whatever fucking action you want to consider.